it's 2018. Pretty much any ColdFusion code that is not written in a proper framework, ColdBox, Framework 1, Taffy even, or something like that, it's probably a legacy app. Most of the time, the things I see.
Welcome back to the show. And today we're going to be looking at migrating legacy ColdFusion code to MVC. That's Model View Controller, for those of you who haven't come across it yet, though it has been around for quite a while. And we'll look in the episode with Nolan Erck, who is the chief genius at South of Shasta. Does a lot of ColdFusion. I think he's been doing software development for like 19 or 20 years now. And we'll look at what MVC is and what problem it solves. And in particular, we'll dig down into Framework 1 and ColdBox, which are two frameworks which use MVC. And we'll also look at dependency injection and why you should be using that in your MVC apps, and how you can use it in Framework 1 and ColdBox, and how you can refactor your real-world procedural code. I think that procedural code maybe is a special way of saying it might be a little like spaghetti, but maybe not. Maybe your code is better. And we'll look at some strategies for migrating large apps over to MVC in phases, so you don't have to freak out with this. And if we get time, we'll also mention CommandBox and Git and how they could help you out to do this faster. So welcome, Nolan.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I know you did a whole day workshop on this at CF Summit out in Las Vegas, and you had hordes of developers learning how to do it. Well, a horde is about 40 people, I think.
Yeah, we had a pretty full room. I think there were about 40 students in the class.
That's great. So what exactly is legacy ColdFusion? Because that term gets thrown around a lot.
It does, and that's a pretty broad, maybe ambiguous term. My opinion is it's 2018. Pretty much any ColdFusion code that is not written in a proper framework, ColdBox, Framework 1, Taffy even, or something like that, it's probably a legacy app. Most of the time, the things I see in my consulting experience are apps that are still predominantly using CFIncludes as their way of being modular, maybe a little bit of custom tags here and there, maybe an occasional CF component that is kind of just wrapping around a couple of functions. But most of the things that I see these days that I would call a legacy app are either just CFIncludes everywhere, or maybe just giant top-down CFM pages with 8, 10, 12,000 lines of code in them. So that's kind of anything in that world is what I would call a legacy app at this point.
10,000 lines of code in one CFM file? That sounds quite a mouthful.
It does. I actually had a project I did for a client a little while back, and there were about 10 .cfm files in their app, and each file was 8 to 10,000 lines of code. It was just one top-down CFM that would post back to itself with different form variables, and that's how they wrote that app. So hopefully I don't see that, or fortunately I don't see that too often, but kind of variations of that theme. A lot of CFIncludes and a lot of self-posting forms that don't quite have a good modular structure to things is what I see a lot of in terms of legacy code.
And you know, just to be the devil's advocate here, what's wrong with keeping your code in that format?
Well, I guess, and that's a fair question. If it's working and you're not changing anything with it, you know, there's the argument for if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The problems come into play when you discover new bugs, when the customers need new features added to it, when you need to support new things, like maybe you want that same chunk of business logic to work to power a mobile app, maybe to power a REST API, things of that nature. When you've got one giant 8,000 line CFM file, you've got all of your business logic, all of your SQL stuff, all of your HTML, and probably JavaScript and other things too, all kind of mangled together. It's really hard to break things out and fix bugs without causing what they call technical debt, or maybe bit rot, other things that just make the code harder to maintain long-term, other things that cause potentially more bugs to be added into the application. You also run into the case of the way modern web development is working, there are a lot of people that are specializing in the front end, people that are becoming very, very good at HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but they don't necessarily touch SQL statements very often at all. And you also have the opposite, people that are great SQL gurus that know ColdFusion and how to write CF query tags that are amazing, and they don't spend a lot of time on the front end writing JavaScript. When you have everything in one file, it's really hard for those two types of people to work together on a project without having conflicts where they're editing the same kind of line of code. If everything is in a repository, you run the risk of lots of merge conflicts and that sort of thing happening, slowing down everyone developing on the app. So when you split things out into more of a modern MVC architecture, it just organizes the code a little bit better to keep the different types of development isolated a little bit better, makes it easier to make one sort of change, like a UI change that is just HTML and CSS, without risking breaking the SQL statements, or vice versa. If I want to fix a SQL statement, I don't run the risk of breaking the JavaScript and that sort of thing. So that's kind of the benefit of why I would go to the trouble of redoing something that's currently an 8,000 line .cfm file.
Well, and also if if people listening do have apps they're maintaining with those giant files, the chances are there's a lot of duplicate code in there, and there's a lot of unused code in
exactly.
there.
A lot of unused code, a lot of things that are very hard to test. One giant .cfm file with, let's say, 10,000 lines in it. My experience has been the way those typically work is there's some sort of web form in the page somewhere, and depending on which fields got filled in the form, different chunks of that file will run accordingly. Oh, the user clicked on button A, run lines 1 through 500 when the form is submitted. If the user clicked on button B or C, run lines 1100 through 1750 when the form is submitted. And so you have to do all of this manual, fill in a form a particular way to run the different individual chunks of code. That's a very manual, tedious process to test everything in the app. If you break things out into, let's say, CF functions and put them in a component, you have all of these individual little units, and then you can run unit test software like TestBox to just automate all of that testing process. If you have individual things that are components or functions, you can also put them in their own separate .cfc file, making that 8,000 line file much, much smaller. You lessen the risk of a change you make breaking the code that you know already works when it's been nice and compartmentalized off into a separate library somewhere. So
yeah, so you avoid that whole whack-a-mole bug fixing thing where you fix one bug and then it causes another one, and you fix that and another one pops up.
Exactly.
Yeah. So sounds like a good thing to move to a modern framework using Model View Controller. For those folks who haven't done it, what exactly is a model, a view, and a controller?
So Model View Controller is that's the generic design name for the design pattern, MVC, Model View Controller. That's a technique you can use in pretty much any object-oriented software development language. So not just ColdFusion, but Java, .NET, C++, Smalltalk, various other OO languages, they all support MVC. And the idea with that is, rather than having one giant file with everything smushed together, you break your app up into three sections. The model is sort of an abbreviated way of saying business model or data model. It's basically where all of your SQL type stuff goes. Your insert and update statements, your select statements to talk to your database, or whatever the other storage thing is you have. If you're talking to XML files, reading and writing files from a network share, that would all be considered your model code, as well as any sort of business logic that lives on top of that SQL statement. So let's say, for instance, I have a table in my database to store user logins, people who can access the app. They have a username field and a password field in the database. My model code is going to have some sort of select statement saying select username and password where the user ID is XYZ to check if someone is logged in or not. In addition to that SQL statement, there's probably a couple of if-else statements afterwards saying if I found a record, then correctly log the user in and save their session. If I did not find a matching record, return some sort of no matching record found or invalid user result back to the other code. So it's not just your SQL statements, it's anything business logic-ish related that touches that stuff and the code that supports it. That's your model. The view is basically the part of your app that users actually view on the screen in their web page. It's the HTML, the CSS, the JavaScript. When you make a view file, It's mostly those things. It's mostly just HTML tags. You include your .css, you include your JavaScript as needed. You put that in the file. There might be a few lines of ColdFusion here and there, things like an if statement saying if the user is logged in, draw the log out button on the screen, else draw the login button. So tiny little bits of, not really business logic, but little bits of branching to make the UI do what it's supposed to do in the given state. What you don't see in the view are flat out CF query tags, giant loops of business logic to check if a user is logged in or anything like that. That's all done back in the model. And then the controller sits between those two things. So when the user is in the view and they click on, let's say, Buy New Products button, the controller looks at that view and so they clicked on the Buy New Products button. Let's go into the model and get the list of new products and return that back to the view and make that show up on the screen. So the model sits between the two and sort of connects the two sides together. The analogy I usually use when I'm teaching this in an intro class is it's sort of like working in a restaurant. When a customer first goes into a restaurant, they're presented with a menu, and this is the thing they can view and see all of the different options they have for what they'd like to order. The customer does not take that information and physically go back in the kitchen themselves. They tell a middleman, the waiter, what they'd like to order from the system. So the waiter in a restaurant is sort of like the equivalent of a controller in a model view controller app. So the waiter doesn't actually make the food. They hand the information back to the kitchen where all of the heavy lifting is done, where all of the storage is, things are taken out of storage, like the fridge and the freezer, where everything is prepared properly. And then when that's done, the waiter then takes that information and brings it back to the front end and hands the result set, the cheeseburger you ordered or whatever, to the customer. And that's kind of the best analogy I've come up with so far on how you would organize your code and how to keep things separate. And that seems to work pretty well for people that are new to OO development. If you think of it like a restaurant with the three different sections, your kitchen, your waiter, and the front end menu / tables where people actually hang out.
And that means when you're maintaining an MVC app, if you're going to change something about how it looks, you only need to look at the view part of it. You don't have to search through the rest of the code. Similarly, if you change the business logic or the database, you know you only need to look at those files.
Exactly.
That are in the model.
Right. And the way modern web development is going, there are a lot of people that specialize in that front part that write a ton of CSS and HTML, and they know amazing tricks for making your user interface look brilliant and support all the fun special effects that new browsers support. And a lot of people do just that for their job, and they don't spend any time learning how to do SQL statements or more advanced back-end ColdFusion tags. So if you split things up into these three different components, or sections rather, those front-end experts have files that are 90% straight HTML and CSS. They can really focus in on the part of the app that they need to focus on and not have to scroll through 1,000 different CF queries and a great big CF switch statement and a bunch of CF directory calls that they don't care about. They don't run the risk of getting lost looking for the piece of code they want. And they don't also run the risk of accidentally deleting some of that code or breaking it when they're just trying to find the form tag they're looking for or whatever. So yeah, you give people a nice kind of separate way to work on things when you do an MVC app as well.
Yeah, and not only does it protect you from the UI experts breaking the back-end code, it also saves you from the back-end code geniuses messing up the CSS and all that clever UI stuff that's being done.
Exactly, yeah.
So,
I run into that a lot too, where back-end developers are great at SQL and ColdFusion, but maybe they're not up to date on what the current HTML5 and CSS3 features are. So just kind of let them work in their own back-end piece and let the front-end developers work on their piece and connect them together with MVC.
And even if it's just you on your own doing the app, it's certainly less mental bandwidth if you know you can just focus on the database bit when you're editing this file, and you can focus on the UI bit in this file instead of having to keep it all in your head at once. So. Oh,
absolutely. And I build applications that way. Even when I'm the only developer on the project, I still use an MVC framework to keep everything organized. Yes, for that reason. So I can focus on the HTML tasks all together and then focus on the SQL tasks all together later. And then again, too, with everything modular like this, it makes it much easier to test the individual sections with an automated tool like TestBox, allowing me to give a better quality product to the customers with much less overhead and work on my end.
Great. So let's assume we've decided we're going to do change our legacy app to MVC, what are the, let's look at some of the most popular MVC frameworks, which would be Framework One or ColdBox. And I think those were the most popular in our recent State of the ColdFusion Union survey.
I think so.
So tell us a bit more about each of those, like just in a nutshell, what is Framework One and what is ColdBox?
So Framework One and ColdBox, they're both model view controller frameworks. So the core features of giving your app structure and breaking everything up into a model view and controller in the middle, both frameworks do that out of the box. Pardon the pun, ColdBox. They both work the same way as far as structuring your app goes. Both of them have a model folder that you put all of your model business logic stuff in. They both have a views section of your app where you put all of the HTML that your app views. And they both also have a controller component in the middle that connects the two together. The differences between the two are Framework One is meant to be a very minimal framework. It's literally one file. You download a file, put it in your app structure, you connect it to your application CFC, and it just starts working. I personally like Framework One for easing developers out of legacy CFML land and into looking at MVC structure. For that reason, it's one file. There's not tons of other stuff that comes with it. It's a very easy way to sort of take developers who might be scared of moving to an object-oriented thing and kind of showing them, look, it's not quite that different than what you're doing now. You have a couple folder names. You have to have folders with these names. You have to use a certain naming convention for things. And when you name your files a certain way, the app sort of just spins up and starts working. And ColdBox does the exact same thing. You name your files a certain way, you put them in a directory structure with a certain naming convention, and the code basically just starts up and running and you're good to go. The difference with Framework One versus ColdBox, the big difference is there are lots of add-on packs, if you will, and other supported products that are part of the ColdBox ecosphere that help if you have like a larger enterprise-sized application. If you're concerned about things like automated testing, having caching options available, things of that nature, there are other add-on packs, for lack of a better phrase, that the ColdBox ecosystem provides for that. And there's also an actual company supporting the ColdBox stuff. Fortis Solutions has a team of developers that that's what they do day in, day out, is they support customers that are using the ColdBox products. Not that you can't use Framework One for professional grade MVC apps. I do. Many other ColdFusion outfits do as well. Like the Mira CMS platform is entirely written on Framework One, and that works great. It's just a kind of a stripped down minimal way of starting your app versus the ColdBox way that's got a few more bells and whistles baked into the app from the get-go.
So if you can go either way with those. Are there any other MVC frameworks that people might come across in the wild?
There are others. There's technically, there's a few others that are still out there. CF Wheels is out there still. I'll be honest, I don't use CF Wheels for anything. So I'm the wrong person to ask about the current status of feature sets in that framework. There are also some that are a little bit older. FuseBox. You might also see information about Model Glue and Mach 2. Those are others that have been around and are technically still in existence, although I don't think they're super widely supported anymore. But they all do the exact same thing that Framework One and ColdBox does. They give your app the model view controller structure. Depending on which one you choose to go with, they may have some other add-on features that you might find benefit your workflow. They all do the same thing, though, as far as give you the model view controller structure and organization to your app. I guess the big difference between the current frameworks, Framework One and ColdBox, versus some of the older ones, FuseBox, Model Glue, and so on, is the current frameworks, they're what they call convention-based frameworks. So you use those frameworks, and then all you have to do is name your files a certain way and name your functions a certain way, and the app just knows how to wire everything together because you follow their naming convention. It's a convention-based framework. It just glues everything together and starts running your app. The other frameworks that I mentioned, Model Glue, FuseBox, and so on, those are what they call configuration-based frameworks. They do the same model view controller thing, but rather than following a naming convention that magically makes everything work, you have some sort of config file, usually a giant XML file or something close to that. And what you do in that config file is you tell the app, when I want this particular event to happen, saving a user to the database, listing the current customers on the screen, whatever the thing is. You have a config file where you go in and say, okay, when that happens, this is the model code I want you to run. After that model code is done, this is the view I want you to have show up on the screen. You kind of glue things together with this config file. At the end of the day, they all do the same thing. Some people just like the config setup a little better than the convention setup, or vice versa.
And then Framework 1 and ColdBox, which camp do they fall in? The config file?
They're both convention-based. You name files a certain way, and they just magically work. There's no XML config to worry about with either of those.
Right. Excellent. So if you're going to try this out, maybe you're going to try out Framework 1 or ColdBox, some legacy code. What's the approach you take to that? Because you might have, like you said, you might have 10,000 line CFM files.
Yeah, you might.
You might, yes.
There are a couple of different ways you can go about it. I've actually got some notes on this topic on southofshasta.com. If you click on the presentations link, I've got my slide deck and some code samples from a talk I gave called MVC with and without a framework. And it steps through taking a small legacy app and moving it into MVC, and then using that MVC code to run it in a Framework 1 kind of setup. So that's a point of reference people can check out if they want to get more information on this. If you kind of understand the concepts of what a model does, what a view and controller does, you have a giant legacy app. I find the easiest part to start with is make a model folder and make some CFCs in there for your CF query stuff. So if you have a couple of giant legacy files, maybe you have a lot of customer or employee queries in your app, if it's like an employee management application, for instance. Make a folder called model, make a file in there called employee.cfc. And then as I find queries in my code doing things like saving a new employee to the system. Okay, well, that's a CF query with an insert statement inside it. I would cut that out of the giant file, paste it into the employee.cfc component, and wrap that in a function called something like save employee. And then instead of having the CF queries inline in my giant file, I can at least start calling that component as needed. That way, if that insert statement is duplicated in 3 or 4 spots in my file, now I don't have that CF query duplicated in 4 spots, I just have calls to this one function. So I'll have more files in my app, but fewer lines of code to manage, and the code I have is more reusable. So I usually start with something like that, move my model stuff into one spot, and then what you have left is some combination of business logic and view things. And then it can get a little bit more tedious. You could try to manually keep going and set up your own sort of MVC folder structure from that point. That's a little bit of what I cover in that MVC with and without a framework talk I mentioned. You could also go with ColdBox or Framework 1, and a thing I've seen people do with some success as well is just take your kind of the larger files. If you have like an employee.cfm, it's got some HTML in it, some business logic, and some SQL queries in it. Make an empty Framework 1 or ColdBox project. Make an event, or an employee detail section in your framework, and just take the entirety of your old employee.cfm legacy file, paste it right into the view in your framework. And it's not going to be a great organized application at that point, but you can at least get the code running in an MVC framework. And once it runs and the URL actually draws the contents on the screen the way it should, then you can kind of work backwards from there and move the CF queries out of the view and put them into the model folder in ColdBox or Framework 1, and start separating things out that way. And I've had some success doing variations of that theme as well on apps for clients of mine. In fact, we're doing that right now with a client who has a very old legacy CFM app that a previous developer wrote and is no longer around. So we're migrating that into a Framework 1 ecosphere for him right now, so that the app has structure, so we can do better mobile support and give him a better, architecture, and just move forward with some modern development for him. So
that's great.
like that. Yeah.
And I think the other step step I've seen is that, often you pull out those bits of model or front end code, and you discover you've got 15 variants of basically the same code.
Exactly.
And then you're figuring out, did they really want 15 different variants of this SQL statement, or is it really supposed to be all the one particular version of it?
Anytime you can delete code and still get the same functionality, that's usually a win. The fewer lines of code you have to look at, the less likely you're going to break something by accident.
Now, I know you mentioned dependency injection in that, and so what exactly is that, and how does that help out with this whole process?
So dependency injection, the short answer for it is the further you go into object-oriented programming, the more classes and objects and CF components you'll have in your application. Dependency injection frameworks help manage getting information in and out of those components. It just makes it a little bit easier for you. Depending on the complexity of your app, a dependency injection framework like DI1 or Wirebox might do a little bit for you. It might save you a whole lot of typing. It gets rid of a lot of the boilerplate code that you have to write in object-oriented development. If I have 5 or 6 different components that all talk to each other, perhaps a better example would be, let's say I have a component that is an employee component. And before that employee component can work, I have to create some sort of login component to make sure the employee can log in. I have to maybe also create some sort of manager component to make sure that the employee has a manager wired up to it. Maybe there's a third component to some sort of, authorization key that I have to pass into the employee before it will work as well. So just to get to that one employee component that I want for my app, I have to make these 3 other objects and pass them into that. So off the top of my head, that might be somewhere in the neighborhood of 5, 6, maybe 7 lines of code I have to write every time I want this one employee component to be created in my app and use that for something. Copy and pasting 6 or 7 lines of code everywhere in my app that I want an employee object to be created gets kind of tedious. We're violating the DRY principle of don't repeat yourself. It's a lot of stuff I just don't want to do as a developer. It's not really moving the application forward. It's just necessary boilerplate to get that one feature done. You can use a dependency injection framework to sort of hide all of that stuff in the back end. So rather than me running the create object tag 5 times to create the 5 different objects just to build up my employee component that I want, I can say, hey, dependency injection framework, please make me an employee. And that dependency injection framework knows what all the boilerplate things are that it needs to do. Make a manager, make an authorization component, make a login component, whatever they are. It just does that all behind the scenes and hands me back my employee component when it's done. So I write one line of code that says, DI framework, go get me an employee, please, and it does it. And then inside the DI framework, it does all the boilerplate stuff magically behind the scenes. I don't have to write that code anymore. I don't have to copy and paste that code anywhere. It just kind of streamlines building those things into my app for me. And then depending on how complex the app is, you can add other features as well that help it out. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, we spent a whole episode, I think it was episode 5 on dependency injection, where we talked for an hour all about dependency injection. So if that sounds intriguing to anyone listening, check out that episode, and I'll put that in the show notes for this episode.
I would like to note, too, that a dependency injection framework is different from a model view controller framework. You do not have to use both of them in your application. You can pick one or the other and get value out of them. So if you are at a spot where you have a giant legacy ColdFusion app and moving the whole thing to a framework, to an MVC app like ColdBox still sounds kind of scary to you, but you know you have lots of spots where you can consolidate 5 component create object calls into one call and that sort of thing, you can just drop a dependency injection framework into your spaghetti app and actually use it right now. You don't have to go the full-on MVC way to get to a dependency injection framework. They're totally separate things. You can add one or the other or both into your app as logistics allow you to do.
That's great. So, if someone has a large app and they want to migrate it to MVC, you mentioned some strategy already for chopping out code and moving it over. But are there any other strategies you recommend people listening do?
There's a component in ColdBox, the name of which is escaping me at the moment, but it's designed for moving legacy apps into the ColdBox framework easily. And I apologize, I don't have the name of it offhand, but there is a feature in ColdBox to help move that over. Other things you can do, not framework-specific feature-wise that help, put your code into a good version control system. Make 2 branches of your code, one called legacy for your current legacy code base, and make another one called MVC. And as you have time, just keep moving features into the MVC version of your app, and then you can switch between the 2 branches and A/B your app as it goes to make sure that your legacy code is still working while you have customers using it. But anytime you add a feature or fix a bug, you can copy that feature into your MVC version, switch to that branch, and double check all the code, make sure it still works, and then kind of slowly move your app into a better structure that way. So that's another thing I'd recommend. Whether you're using Framework 1, ColdBox, whatever, a good version control system will help make this process quite a bit easier.
And a good one might be Git.
Yeah, Git.
That's the
GitHub.
Most popular one.
Yeah, GitHub is Git's the good protocol that everyone likes. GitHub accounts are free now, or super cheap if you need a private repository. And there's also other players in that field. Unfuddle.com does really well for Git and Subversion projects. There's Atlassian and Bitbucket and a handful of others that are all great, and they all have different bells and whistles and options for number of developers that can join the project and that sort of thing. So you just pick whichever one you need and go from there. And the nice thing about the Git companies too is the projects are all transferable. So if you set up a Git repository on, for example, Unfuddle, and decide, oh, I need a feature that only Atlassian supports, you just import your repository into Atlassian and all your code is still there, all your branches are still there. You're not having to start over at ground zero or anything like that.
That's a great tip there. So anything else you'd recommend people do if they're contemplating moving a large legacy app?
It's a big project. It's a fair amount of tedious kind of work. When you move to an MVC framework, all of the URLs in your app are going to change. You're no longer going to be going straight to sitename.com/employeedetails.cfm. In a framework, you're going to go to sitename.com/index ? And then some sort of URL config thing telling the framework which model, view, and controller combine together to make the employee detail event or scope or whatever the naming convention is that they use in that framework. So there's a fair amount of tedious kind of work for it. Maybe get a good set of headphones and a cup of coffee and just break the work up into individual tasks in some sort of good project management software, so you can follow along how far you're at in moving the code over.
So you don't want to be trying to do several other things at the same time?
I wouldn't. No, I would make this kind of its own separate task. If you have a bug fix you have to put in your legacy app today because a customer is complaining, I would put that fix in the legacy branch just like you normally would. And then I would make a separate task to say, okay, now that that fix is in the legacy version, let's make an item on our Scrum board to move that into the MVC version. And I would just kind of manually move things over that way until the final MVC version is ready. And in addition to that, I would make separate tasks for things like update all of the URLs in the app, move all of our CF queries into a model folder, things like that as I would get into it.
Mm. Now, some of the tools that might help you out with this are CommandBox.
Yes.
For folks who haven't used CommandBox, what is that?
So CommandBox is sort of the ColdFusion world's answer to Node. Node has been the big thing in the JavaScript land that lets you run JavaScript from the command line as opposed to in a web browser. And Node also lets you basically run a JavaScript server, if you will, from the command line and run all your code that way without having to switch gears, and it puts everything in one language and ecosphere. So that's why the Node has taken off really well in the JavaScript land. So CommandBox, which is another Order Solutions product, kind of brings us that same setup into CFML. Rather than having to go to a browser and set up a new website in IIS, rather than having to manually install ColdFusion, CommandBox makes all of that a command line thing. I can just type up a couple things at the DOS prompt, and it does it. If I need to switch from ColdFusion version 10 to 11, I don't have to manually go up to adobe.com, look for ColdFusion 11, enter my Adobe ID, download it with the little Adobe download client that they have used sometimes. I don't have to go through any of these steps to do it. You just, in CommandBox, you say, please start up a ColdFusion 11 server, and CommandBox goes out to the cloud, grabs the jar, and runs it in seconds. There's no manual config involved in doing that. If I want to switch from, I can switch from any version of ColdFusion, I believe 9 and up. It might be 10 and up, but you can switch between 10 and 11. If there's a particular hot fix in, let's say, version 11 that I want, I can say, go get version 11.1.02 or whatever the particular build is I'm looking for. You can also switch between Adobe CF and versions of Lucy and Rilo by doing that same command line trick. You just type in, please use Lucy 5.1 now, and it will go out to the cloud, grab that jar file, and boom, you're running on Lucy 5. I have a client that I saw this week, actually. They needed a new ColdFusion server up and running for a really tiny web app. So I went into their office, looked at what they have, thought, okay, what are you using here? And they said, well, it's basically this one page with a forum post on it. It does a couple of database queries, and that's about all we use it for. Okay. Ran box server start, Lucy 5.2, and had them up and running on a new instance of Lucy in minutes. It really streamlines web development. So if you have to do QA work between different types of ColdFusion, it gives you the ability to write command line tools in CFML. If you need to write a tool to copy files from one directory to another, things like that, you can do it all in CFML now. It also automates, again, back to the Node example, one of the things Node lets you do is you have a .json file to basically build fancier JavaScript projects. You have an Angular app with lots of CSS frameworks that it uses, maybe some jQuery plugins and that sort of thing. You can write little recipe.json files that Node will use to say, go out to these 5 different GitHub repositories, grab all the code from them, copy them down into my project, move a couple of tasks around, rename this file, whatever the manual stuff is you have to do to set up a project to get it working. Node lets you do all of that from a command line. And now with CommandBox, we can do all of that in the ColdFusion land as well. You have the same kind of .json file to configure where all the dependencies are for your project. It will go out to the different GitHub repositories and grab them all for you. We even have a second JSON config file in CommandBox for controlling the settings in your ColdFusion admin. So let's say part of your setup in a project is you have to add you have to turn a particular caching option on and off, or you have to add a data source to your app so that it talks to a database. Typically, you would go out you'd open a browser, go to CFIDE/administrator, log in, go to data sources, do all this manual stuff. With CommandBox, that's all a scripted option now from a .json file. Just put your data source information in the file, and you're done. You never have to manually go into the admin anymore. You can just set up your development environment, and it works quite nicely. So things like that, the day-to-day mundane tasks for setting up a new development project, a lot of that sort of work is now automated, scriptable, reusable, saves a lot of time and hassle with ColdFusion projects, all because of CommandBox.
That is great. And we'll talk about the cost of CommandBox and some of these other tools in a moment. But first, are there any other tools that would help someone moving legacy code over to MVC? Oh,
there's probably lots of things that help. CommandBox is a pretty big favorite of mine right now. I use that a lot. A good source control app like SourceTree and a good GitHub or similar account. Those are all useful tools. Get a good IDE as well that supports CFML. I'm currently using Sublime Text for a lot of my development, but ColdFusion Builder is also great if you need to go in and refactor code very quickly. Any of the Eclipse-based IDEs will work, like CF Builder. I think CFIncludes is still technically around if you wanted to try that. Yeah, Sublime has some good CFML support now. There are a few others that have CFML options in them as well you can try. It just depends on, I would just pick whichever.
I'm pretty sure, yeah, whichever you like. There's a lot of discussion about IDEs, and yeah, really it's whatever works for you. Though I think Sublime is probably the most popular one these days.
It seems like
it certainly was in the survey we did. And I'm imagining that having more than one monitor probably helps you when you're moving code around between all the different places.
I guess, yeah, that could be a thing that people use. I personally don't use two monitors. I use one. but it just depends on what your workflow is and how you visualize relationships between code.
So let's talk the cost of some of these tools. I know some of them are open source. So Framework One, that's open source, that's free. CommandBox is free. There's free versions of Git, though you can pay if you want more privacy or other features.
Yep.
ColdBox, I seem to recall, is paid.
ColdBox is a free
right,
product.
or?
You can download ColdBox and use it for free to build whatever applications you want. If you need support for like training, if you want to block off like a 3-day workshop to learn how to do something in ColdBox, then the Ortus folks do have different training options available and support options, and they charge for some of that. That's how they keep the machine rolling and add new features to ColdBox. But no, if I wanted to make 10 new web apps today and run them all on ColdBox, it would cost me $0. You can absolutely use that for free. I think the only things that we've discussed that have a pay component would be Sublime Text is technically free, but if you continue using it, you'll get a little nag screen that pops up saying, hey, you should probably support this app. And it's written by, I think, one lone developer. It's not written by a big behemoth company with millions of dollars. So it's kind of nice to support the little outfits like that and show them, hey, I do like your product and I use it, to be productive. I think the cost on Sublime Text is somewhere in the neighborhood of $30 or $35. So it's not terribly expensive if you do want to buy it and support the gentleman who's making it. Git.
I'd encourage people, if they're using it, to pay.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's another developer behind that software.
Exactly. Support the products that you enjoy and that are making you productive, so that they can continue being productive as well. And
then CF Builder is paid.
CF Builder's paid.
I'm forgetting how much.
I think there's a 30-day trial version of that for free as well if you want to check it out. And then, if I remember correctly, it will continue working after 30 days. It just several of the fancier features get kind of disabled. I think that's right. It's been a little while since I've turned on CF Builder.
I forget what's that. What do we call? Yeah, what's that called? Not shareware, but I'm forgetting like the phrase for that.
Trialware?
Trialware.
Sure.
Yeah, maybe. Noveldware.
Yeah,
something like that.
Crippleware? Is it cripple? Is that what they call it? I'm not sure.
That wouldn't be very PC, yeah. I don't think.
Well,
and then source.
Right. Can you edit that for me?
Yes, there you go.
Thank you.
So SourceTree.
SourceTree is free. I believe you have to make an account at Atlassian.com before it will work, but making an account is also free. And the nice thing about SourceTree is it works on Windows and Mac, so you don't have to pick one platform. ColdFusion Builder is also the same way. It works on Windows and Mac. And then Git itself, you technically need a Git provider hosting company of some sort, like GitHub.com or Unfuddle or Bitbucket or one of those. Git has free options for accounts. I think the catch with that is your code has to be public open source. They might give you like one option for you get one free repository. I'd have to double check. There's also Unfuddle and Bitbucket, and they all usually have some combination of a free account and then various tiers up from there that you can go with, depending on how many projects you have, how much privacy you need, how big your project is, and that sort of thing. Offhand, I know GitHub.com has a pretty good account for most developers. It's around $7 or $8 a month, and it gives you unlimited private repositories and unlimited public repositories. So make as many free open source things as you want. And if you also have 15 or 20 clients that need private repos, set them up in that same account and everything will just continue working for you. And then of course, if you have a bigger team and need bigger functionality, you can go, there's like a GitHub organization account, and there's Bitbucket has different accounts, and Beanstalk, and some of the other options are out there for you too. So yeah, I think the only things to pay for maybe an IDE and maybe a fancier GitHub account. Everything else is pretty much free.
And all the coffee you're going to drink to refactor the code.
Exactly.
So let's just change gears a little and, tell us why you're proud to use CF today.
Well, I'm a consultant for a living, and clients will call and say, we'd like you to build this web app or mobile app for us. What do you think the best option is to maximize return on investment, get things done quickest, that sort of thing. And as a consultant, I do try to be as objective as I can and look at, okay, what technology are they currently using? What options are available? What kind of problems do I have to solve? And 9 times out of 10, when I'm building kind of a standard web app, ColdFusion is just the better way to go. I get more done per line of code out of the box than I do with tools like .NET or PHP or some of the other options out there. It makes me more productive more quickly. So that's why I tend to continue going with CFML.
That's a great reason. I tend to think if ColdFusion was made in Redmond with that Microsoft stamp on it, it probably would, be even more successful than it is today.
Yeah, I can see
just
that.
Because so many shops just have those Microsoft filters on. If it isn't Microsoft, then we don't like it. But they're missing out.
Agreed.
So, there has been talk in the past about how ColdFusion is dying, and I think that's pretty ridiculous because, more and more sites use it, and Adobe sells more and more licenses. I was just interviewing Kershaw. I'm spacing on his last name, but it'll come to me.
Too,
I'll put the episode in the show notes. And I think it's Balakrishna, or I probably just totally mangled it there, but something very close to that. And he was saying they're selling more and more every year. And apparently he talked about that that was talked about at the CF Summit from the main keynote. So my question is, what would it take to make ColdFusion even more alive for the people listening?
That's a good question. It's definitely still a unique product compared to a lot of the things that it gets compared to, even if those comparisons are sometimes unfair. People often say ColdFusion versus .NET or ColdFusion versus PHP, and those aren't really fair apples-to-apples comparisons in all the different ways. You just get more features in a ColdFusion install than you do in, let's say, a basic PHP install. And you have the support from a company like Adobe behind it, whereas PHP is more of a community-driven project. There's not really a company I can call and blame if I find a bug in PHP as directly as I can call Adobe and say, hey, there's an issue here. Can you send a consultant out and fix it or whatever. So I think part of it's going to be somehow fixing that perspective people have of it gets kind of unfairly compared to a lot of tools that are free, and finding other ways to get it in front of people that use it for more of the what I'll call sexy .com startup ideas. A lot of the new startups that are happening now tend to go with a stack like Node or Ruby, things of that nature that are, at first glance, more of the free scriptable command line interface tools. My hope is that the success of things like CommandBox will help push ColdFusion forward in that direction, because using CommandBox makes developing ColdFusion very similar to the workflow you would use for developing, let's say, a Ruby app or Node app. So hopefully some combination of those things, and Adobe's continued support, and the Lucy folks moving forward with their version as well, we'll start to get more traction on that and get rid of this ColdFusion is dead perspective.
Yeah, I'm working on stamping out that meme from the whatever blogosphere or the mental thoughts that people have, because I really think ColdFusion is alive, and we've done more than 50 interviews on this podcast already in the last year.
That's great.
A lot of other people, think the same. It is. A lot of you were at least 3 of them, Nolan, because you're such a nice guy.
I do what I can.
So, but yes, and also I think there were 6 ColdFusion conferences last year.
Sounds about right. Yeah.
The Muracon and CF Camp and CF Summit East and CF Summit Las Vegas and Into the Box and the NC DevCon, and I probably missed a name of a really important conference. But let me know in the messages, people, if you're listening to this episode and I missed your conference out. So I think that's a good thing. So talking about CF Summit, big conference, hundreds of people, all ColdFusion folks. What did you enjoy about CF Summit this year?
You actually hit the nail on the head right there. I enjoyed seeing hundreds of CF folks in one spot. The other conferences are all really good, and I learned a lot at Into the Box, for instance. That was a great cutting edge conference where I learned quite a bit of new, current, modern CFML development techniques. But the Into the Box conference itself is physically smaller in size. They're growing each year. It just hasn't gotten to the size yet of ColdFusion Summit. So the nice thing about Summit was going to a conference for a product that has that perspective of, oh, ColdFusion is dying, and just looking around the keynote room and seeing 400, maybe 500 CFML developers all there, eager to learn new ColdFusion techniques and development ideas. So I very much liked seeing the large breadth of people there, seeing some of the new things that are moving forward with the new version of ColdFusion 2018 and hearing the features that they're working on for the future of that. That was great. I always enjoy talking to the folks from Order Solutions and Blue River to find out what they're doing with their products. All of the Order stuff and Mira CMS are sort of some of the flagship CFML apps out there that help put that technology in front of a lot of different people. So I very much like seeing what they're up to, talking to the other outfits and other folks, finding out what they're doing with ColdFusion. Yeah, it was overall a really good conference. And the folks
of course, it's in Las Vegas.
Yes, it's in Vegas, which never hurts for fun and enjoyment after the conference is done. And the folks at Convective wrote a ColdFusion tuning guide that they debuted at ColdFusion Summit this year too. So that was another nice thing to see, helping to get people moving forward with writing better ColdFusion apps, was that guide from Convective.
It's great.
Sorry, excuse me, I have a phone ringing.
So no worries. So if people want to find you online, Nolan, what are the best ways to do that?
They can find my company at southofshasta.com. I'm also on Twitter at southofshasta. They can also email me, nolan@southofshasta.com. And I'm on GitHub as Nolan Erck, E-R-C-K. You can track me down that way. And I'll also be at Into the Box in April, giving a talk on connecting Vue.js with ColdFusion. So they can come say hi to me there as well.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for being on the CF Live podcast, and have fun at all the conferences you go to this year.
My pleasure, and likewise.